Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 205. This is a long overdue episode. I've been meaning to actually map out all this stuff for quite some time. We're going to be talking about spondylolysis, which is a fancy way of saying stress fractures of the spine, in particular, adolescent spines. We see a lot of these in the baseball and softball worlds, certainly tennis players, soccer players, very, very common things, unfortunately, in extension and rotation athletes. We've seen a ton of them over the years at CSP and are really comfortable with managing them both on the rehab and the concurrent training side of things, as well as the return to play after folks have dealt with this. Super nuanced discussion, both in terms of the causes, the prevention, and more importantly, the treatment of those who have it. Before we get to it, though, I actually wanted to give you a quick heads up that it's also an exciting week in CSP world because we released our new collaboration with New Balance. So the CSP Minimus training shoe is now available. If you go to newbalance.com and just search for CSP, you'll get a quick visual of that. It's available in both men's and women's sizes. Really excited about this shoe. Super versatile training shoe that you can use whether you're sprinting, changing directions, throwing med balls, lifting weights, whatever it is that you're working with. Again, that's CSP. Quick search at newbalance.com and you can check it out. It's a very limited edition run, so don't wait on this one if you want to get a pair. This episode is brought to you by AG1, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it can be difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can often wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where AG1 can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. That's why I use it daily, as do several of my family members, and we recommend it to a lot of our top athletes. One scoop of AG1 contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients that work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet to support energy, focus, digestion, and recovery. And this can all happen for less than $3 per day and without taking multiple products. While most nutritional supplements come to market and stay stagnant, AG1 continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing over 50 improvements in the last decade alone. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best tasting nutrition habit on the planet. Whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, it'll work for you, and it contains less than 1 gram of sugar per serving. They put 75 ingredients through the rigorous NSF certification test to come up with a safe formula that's trusted by some of the world's top athletes, including many of our own at Cressey Sports Performance. Right now, AG1 is giving our listeners a special offer of 10 free travel packets with their first purchase. Just head to drinkag1.com/Cressey and claim this special offer. These travel packets are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health while you're traveling for games, training, or simply on the go. They can be great counterbalance to the less than ideal on-the-road food options that are out there for a lot of our traveling baseball players. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance of getting nutrient diversity, head to drinkag1.com/Cressey to get 10 free travel packets with your first purchase. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Cressey, Cressey. You won't regret it. All right, it's time to talk about spondylolysis. Obviously, it's all alphabet soup right there, something that overwhelms a lot of young athletes, coaches, and parents when they're first exposed to this complex term. At the end of the day, it's really a vertebral stress fracture, something we see in adolescent athletes who are involved in extension and rotation sports. Sometimes you'll also get a description known as spondylolisthesis, which is something that's a related pathology, and really what it speaks to is vertebral slippage. So all these athletes are in a normal lordotic posture that may be a little bit more exaggerated, so they wind up with extra stress when they extend and rotate through the spine. We get something called the spondylolisthesis on top of the spondylolysis. We have a little bit more slippage, so imagine a low back that's arched extra, creating more extension-based stress for those athletes, both at rest and certainly with activities. So Spondies are near and dear to me. I actually started managing my first one all the way back in 2005 when I first moved to Boston. For those of you who don't know, the back brace that is used in these cases is actually nicknamed the Boston brace. So we see a lot of adolescent athletes that wind up in back braces for this. I'll get into that a little bit later on, but I had a lot to learn when I first got these athletes. Really, it was about, for me, giving them a training effect while they were in their brace, while they were waiting for their fracture to heal up. It was a very eye-opening experience just working through it. And the more and more I dug into it, the more I realized that this was a very underserved population. And hopefully we can help some of those folks out just with this podcast, and I'll work my way through it. Over the years, we probably managed 300 of these, since 2005. And those are just the ones that we know happen. If you really look at the research, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, this is an incidental finding. Most athletes that are involved in baseball, soccer, tennis actually have these and don't even know they're there. So let's work through that a little bit. But to start off, when you hear about a spondy, typically the area that's injured is the pars interarticularis. So really what this is, to dumb it down a lot, it's the portion of the spine that kind of connects one segment to the next. It connects the vertebral body in the front with the vertebral joints behind it. And it's nicknamed a Scotty dog fracture because when you look at this on imaging, the pars actually looks like a dog and the fracture actually looks like a collar on the dog. You can have both traumatic and insidious onset. So in other words, this is something that could happen on one swing, or certainly a fall or a hit in football. But you can also get this insidious onset, something that just gradually creeps up. And then all of a sudden, after an extended period of time, an athlete just can't take it anymore. So they go and they get it diagnosed. Depending on the location, the pain may be centralized, but more commonly, it's one-sided back pain. We do see a lot of scenarios where athletes have these on both sides. They may have one, and then, over the course of time, they develop a fracture on the opposite side because they effectively have an unstable spine at this particular segment. So here's where it gets really, really interesting. When you're a parent of a 15-year-old kid who has one of these, where they took a swing and, went down crippled in pain, and you went and got diagnosed with a stress fracture, you think this is just something that happened, kind of like a fall off a swing set or, a car accident or something like that. In reality, these are actually far more common than we realize. So there was a landmark study done back in 2000 by Soler and Calderon, and they looked at elite Spanish athletes. And these are athletes that, were from a wide variety of sports. And they actually found that 8% of elite Spanish athletes were affected. So 8 out of every 100. The highest prevalence, 27%, was in track and field throwers. Again, extension and rotation sports. 17% of rowers had them. 14% of gymnasts had them. 13% of weightlifters had them. It was most commonly L5. 84% of the diagnosed cases were at L5. But at L4, they saw 12% of them. Multiple level involvements in only 3 levels of cases. I would actually say that number is probably significantly higher as you get to an older population. It was bilateral 78% of the time. So if you saw one on the left, you're probably going to see one on the right. But what was really fascinating about this study is only 50 to 60% of those actually diagnosed on imaging actually reported low back pain. So really, if you're doing the math on this, 1 in 25 athletes has a stress fracture in their back that they don't even know is there. It was equally prevalent among males and females, although we did see more spondylolisthesis, so more of that vertebral slippage in females, which makes sense. Women tend to have more resting anterior pelvic tilt than men do. So they estimated the prevalence of spondylitis at 15 to 63%, with the highest prevalence among weightlifters. So this is really, really eye-opening in the sense that that's an incredibly wide range, 15 to 63%. And it really has most to do, I think, with the age of the athletes, what sports they're involved in. So if you look at a population full of baseball players, it's probably going to be much, much higher than if you look in a population of, say, field hockey players who spend more time in flexion. It's just going to be very different. So you have some things to consider. Is the pathology the problem, or is it that multiple pathologies are making people more symptomatic? In other words, maybe it's people that have a stress fracture, have poor movement quality, they're more likely to reach threshold. But my guess is that we're talking 25 years after this study was published. My guess is that these numbers are exponentially higher. So first and foremost, we're in an era where everybody wants to compete, but nobody wants to train, right? Training, preparing, it's not as fun, it's not as sexy as competition. So we have a lot of athletes that are hyper specialized and playing, 100 baseball games as a 12-year-old. So unfortunately, as a society, we're less prepared than ever when it comes time to compete. And socially and economically, opportunities for sport participation are available year round. And this is particularly the case in America, where it's kind of a double whammy. You have more opportunities to participate year round, but just as significantly for this discussion, there are more opportunities to participate in extension and rotation sports. So, in other words, they have lacrosse, they have hockey here, we play baseball here. We're involved a lot more of these sports versus you don't have those in Spain where this study was actually run. Secondly, we have more contact sports, and you will see scenarios where athletes develop some of these issues, or they drive them over the symptomatic threshold on a hit in football or lacrosse, something like that, maybe hockey. And then last but not least, but is clinically significant, something I'll talk about later, is strength training. So lifting is way more accepted in the US than it is in Spain. So when we saw that higher prevalence in weightlifters, it probably gave rise to this discussion that we really probably are doing some damage in the weight room if we aren't lifting in an age appropriate manner. So all things that we have to keep in mind. The incidence is really, really high. I'm sure that if you walk through any gym in the US full of adolescent athletes, you're going to see a ton of stress fractures on imaging, even if those athletes don't actually have problems. So what this really gives rise to, something that I've always taught our staff, and certainly something that I've tried to speak publicly about, is that, as a standard rule of thumb in sports medicine, if you have an athlete who has lumbar spine, so low back pain of more than 3 to 5 days, you got to refer them out just to rule out a fracture. And unfortunately, these things are often misdiagnosed. They'll get missed on x-ray actually relatively frequently. They frequently are undiagnosed, and they'll respond often, to some degree with modalities, whether it's heat or ice or ultrasound or some kind of exercise without extension or even chiropractic manipulation. They'll do okay. Unfortunately, these modalities they're treating the pain, the spasm, the inflammation, but they're not really working on the underlying fracture. So what we get is a population of athletes that unfortunately are just picking the scab over and over again, where they're taking a week off, they're going right back to activity. I see this a lot, actually in my daughter's world. I have twin 10-year-old daughters that are super into gymnastics. And when you just go into the gym, you see a lot of kids who have dealt with this. And it's kind of the rest and test mentality, where they take 2 weeks off, go right back to it. And the stress fracture rate is off the chart in those young athletes. So something to consider, but acute diagnosis is rare, where they catch it really, really early. Usually these things are really stubborn. But when they do get it, they usually get pretty good healing on it. So what's interesting is there is a big debate about how you manage these. And this is something that I've actually seen from two different perspectives. As I mentioned, the first one I saw was in Massachusetts all the way back in 2005. I was a regular in Massachusetts until 2014 when we opened the Florida location. For an extended period of time, I would go back and forth a little bit. So maybe it was 9 months in Florida, 3 months in Mass. And what's very interesting is up in Massachusetts, where they have the Boston back brace, almost all of the stress fractures are put in a brace, usually 12 to 16 weeks, where they'll do it. It's a great way to get, some good healing. The imaging looks better on the tail end, so they try to knock it out right away. Down here in Florida, very rarely do they brace folks. So it's definitely a methodology thing. They usually reserve bracing in Florida for folks who have not responded well to conservative treatment. What's interesting about the brace, if you look at it, it's very restrictive. It really blocks the amount of hip extension and flexion you can have, and then it goes all the way up and blocks some of your lower thoracic motion as well. So what it's really trying to do is just limit how much extension and rotation you can get through the spinal segments that are injured. So, if you look at some of the research, there's only about 2 degrees of rotation that really should happen at everything from T10 to T11 all the way down to L4, L5, and even less at L5, S1. Those are big vertebral bodies where you don't want a whole lot of rotation taking place. So the idea behind the brace is they strap athletes in it for the overwhelming majority of the day. They restrict their activities, and the goal is just to get healing similar to what you would get if you put a cast on a fractured humerus or something to that effect. So the challenge is those braces are really stupid proof. One athlete once told me it's easy to sit in terrible posture. In other words, it just holds me perfectly upright. So what you get when you throw a passive brace on like that is a lot of just atrophy of both muscular function, muscle mass, all that stuff. So I always advocate for, if an athlete is put in the back brace, we want to make sure they're getting out of it. They're doing physical therapy a couple times a week in a very controlled environment, because we want to make sure we preserve a lot of their movement capacity. Now, if you have an athlete who is not braced, you have to be very, very direct with them about activity modification, because what you don't want them to do is just go out and pick the scab every day, whether it's the positions they sit in, how they sleep, or them just kind of dabbling in sport participation. My biggest criticism of the brace is, in many cases, an athlete will get out of it. They'll have good healing. The follow-up CT scan or MRI will show that it's in a good spot, and a doctor will just clear the athlete to go return to the activity. Unfortunately, what happens is when you wear that brace for an extended period of time, it can actually create some problems where an athlete has aberrant sprint mechanics. They've lost a lot of rotational capacity. Both their hips and their thoracic spine are very stiff. So they go right back to some of the same things that cause problems. Some doctors will use a transitional brace, a soft brace, just to give people a chance to kind of, gradually expose themselves to it. But most importantly to me is, if someone comes out of the brace, they need to go through, a pretty good period, 4 to 8 weeks of reconditioning. It can be shorter if the athlete has actually done physical therapy throughout their process. But I think that's vitally important. Big picture, as I mentioned, I've been at this for 20 years now. I honestly can't say whether I've seen better results with the brace or without the brace. I think it's really something that's dependent on the athlete, and how adherent they are to the protocols in place. So I think more than anything, the brace is probably good for an athlete who isn't good with self-restraint, but that's better conversation for doctors that are doing the diagnoses. We interrupt this podcast with a quick reminder that this episode is brought to you by AG1. It's an NSF certified all-in-one superfood supplement that features 75 whole food sourced ingredients designed to support your body's nutritional needs. I use this product daily myself, and a ton of our athletes do as well. Head to drinkag1.com/Cressey and claim my special offer of 10 free travel packets with your first purchase. AG1 gives you peace of mind that you're covering all your nutritional bases. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Cressey, CRESSEY, and you'll get that special offer. To take a step back with this, though, I do think it's important to have a discussion about the risk factors for stress fractures in low back. Obviously, we've talked about sport participation. We know that adolescents are most likely to have this challenge. Certainly, poor bone mineral density would be the first of our intrinsic risk factors for it. Poor lower limb alignment, poor foot structure. These are things that can exacerbate some of those extension and rotation stresses. Faulty muscular recruitment patterns, certainly if an athlete doesn't work well, movement-wise, that can predispose them to some stuff. We want a lot more motion through our thoracic spine and our hips versus just selling out for the dream in the spine. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but taller athletes generally are more susceptible to these issues. Certainly an athlete that goes through a massive growth spurt is often the most susceptible to this. I've seen a lot of 6'3", 180-pound kids who walk in with stress fractures. Body type plays into this. Obviously, it's an extension of height, but when we see taller athletes, they generally have longer spines that are harder to control. Certainly, bone pathologies are concerning for this. You may see athletes that could have certain predispositions, whether it's because of medications they may be on or some predisposition. Anytime I see a distal humeral fracture in a baseball player, I'm immediately thinking of whether there's a bone cancer scenario. Certainly menstrual hormone irregularities are things that you potentially want to rule out. We know that there's susceptibility during certain portions of the menstrual cycle for ACL injuries, but I think some of these same concerns are in play when we're talking about bony issues like this. And then last but not least, there's a genetic predisposition. We do see more of these in Inuit populations than we do in Caucasians, and we don't see them very often in African American populations. So these are things to keep in mind, from an intrinsic standpoint. But extrinsically, we'll see a lot of different outside factors that can cause this. So like a change in training surface is a big one. If a a runner all of a sudden swaps and goes onto, like a hard surface versus running on a track. That could be something. Inappropriate training regimen. We see these a lot during preseason when an athlete rolls in and jumps right into preseason with tons and tons of volume. So we see them a lot early in the baseball season when kids ramp up hitting, throwing, and their distance running or conditioning as part of practice. Certainly, poor conditioning, muscular fatigue is an extrinsic factor. We see athletes who haven't built up their pitch count, and all of a sudden they go out for 110 pitches. They're not just at risk of shoulder and elbow pathology, but low backs can be problems as well. Anytime you see a rapid jump in workload, you are more susceptible to issues like this. As I mentioned, the sporting discipline is certainly a big consideration for this. So sports that demand repetitive, low back, hyperextension, trunk rotation, and to some degree axial loading can be problematic. Footwear can absolutely play into this. Being in the wrong footwear can put people in tough positions. Cigarette smoking is an extrinsic risk factor as well. Not the greatest thing for bone, obviously. And then insufficient nutrition. I think this lines up to some degree with some of the menstrual concerns that I mentioned intrinsically. But if you're not getting enough total calories in, calcium, vitamin D, these are all issues. And as I mentioned, there may be certain medications that make athletes a little bit more susceptible to these problems. So, at the end of the day, there are things that we can certainly control, right? We can control our training volume and intensity. We can control how we move with good training programs. We can control our nutritional status. We control whether we put tobacco or, certain prescription medications. And we're not going to do a whole lot to change our height. We're not going to do a whole lot to change our genetic predisposition, our ethnicity. Those are non-modifiable past. But I do think, that we have to make sure that when we do see one of these athletes, so as I mentioned earlier, we're always getting a physical therapist involved during that process, even if an athlete is braced, and that they're proactive. We can train a lot of athletes throughout their entire stress fracture protocol. You could probably come into a weight room and not even notice who they are. In fact, they're doing a lot of the normal stuff. We're just modifying exercise selections, coaching them a little bit differently. We've had athletes that have trained in their back brace. They just throw a shirt over it. You never know they even have it on. I think it's really important to appreciate the psychological aspect of this for a young athlete. Just shutting somebody down for 12 to 16 weeks and throwing them in an uncomfortable back brace is not ideal. But if you are going to work with them, you do have to appreciate the restrictions of the brace. I mentioned that there's loss of motor control for key core stabilizers. I think that's why it's important for athletes to get out of that brace a little bit. The bracing can restrict the hip flexion and extension. It can restrict thoracic spine rotation. We definitely see altered sprint mechanics when athletes kind of come out of the brace. They don't have much hip flexion. They've lost some hip rotation as well, just from not being able to train rotation very much. When we get them out of the brace, we're avoiding axial loading. My rule of thumb is after someone has had a Spondy and they're asymptomatic, I wait about 2 years before I put a bar on their back. I'm okay with things like goblets and working into deadlifting and stuff like that, or even the front squat grip, but I'm not going to throw a barbell back squat at them for quite some time. We'll spend some time in front squat grip, things like that. It's hard to train rotation while folks are in their braces, but we do like to, start to integrate that early on after they get out as an opportunity to teach them how to get rotation in the right places. So that speaks to how we manage the braces, but I think big picture, how we manage spondies, and this is both how we prevent them and how we would work back from them, is you can kind of categorize folks into 5 different scenarios. So the first scenario, it's the loosey-goosey young athlete. They're typically very young. These are your 14 and under populations. They're your kids that maybe haven't gone through growth sports. Often they're female. My daughters are gymnasts, so I see a ton of these in like the 12-year-old females with poor core control and loads of passive range of motion. They're all Gumby and they're involved in a sport that demands tons and tons of passive flexibility into lumbar extension. So with these athletes, you're going to get them comfortable in a weight room safely. You're going to add motor control to the system, and you're also going to educate them on monitoring volume. And frankly, in this population, sometimes puberty actually makes you look very smart in these athletes because they develop a bit of ligamentous stiffness. And the growth spurt actually can cut back on some of their passive extension and rotation range of motion. So it's a little bit harder for them to get to the extremes where they would actually fracture. Again, these are the same strategies that you would use for an athlete with or without a stress fracture, whether you're trying to prevent it or trying to work backwards from it. Obviously, you have to monitor the symptoms, but if they're loosey goosey, add some motor control to it. The second scenario would be your classic 6'3", 180-pound athlete, right? It's a narrow infrasternal angle. They have huge amounts of rotational capacity. Think NFL wide receiver, triple jumper, elite baseball pitcher. These are athletes that have tons and tons of rotation they can't control. So you have to add motor control to the system, and you kind of learn to tame the rotational patterns, whether that's the delivery for a pitcher or the swing for a hitter or the serve for a tennis player. You're teaching them how to just not get excessive with their range of motion, but share that range of motion over all the joints. Because these athletes are challenging. There can be huge forces going through the body because they're so anthropometrically blessed. They have these long arms and legs and this rib cage that just rotates like crazy. So they can move fast, but unfortunately they lack the underlying physical capacity to safely control all that motion. My buddy Derek Johnson is a major league pitching coach with the Reds. He used the analogy of arms that are writing checks the butt can't cash. But I think the same thing can be true of spines. It's a lot of forces going through an unprepared spine. So what's interesting about these athletes is years later, they simply become oblique strains because the bone has become more mature at that point. So it's no longer the path of least resistance, but the same underlying problems. Weak athletes with tons and tons of rotational capacity wind up with challenges here. Or they might just have, your classic low back tightness, QL restrictions, things along those lines. They just don't know how to move in space very, very well because they lack good underlying stability. Scenario 3 is kind of an extension of scenario 2. It's that same 6'3", 180-pound athlete, but they've lost range of motion because of a growth spurt or from a lot of bad training. So, I talked about a narrow infrasternal angle. This would be what we would call a compressed narrow. So in these instances, you really need to recapture some of that global rotation and then teach the athlete how to better sequence that rotation. If you're familiar with on-base U, they use the lunge with extension test. These compressed narrows, they fail this test miserably. They have no length through their ab. They're very kind of clenched down through their rectus abdominis and their external obliques. When you actually go to test their infrasternal angle, the sternum doesn't rise at all when they inhale. In some cases, they may actually feel a lot better after you do soft tissue work on the abs, the obliques, even accidentally getting better from some visceral manipulation. So if you see a tall, skinny kid with terrible thoracic rotation, this is likely what you're dealing with. They're basically getting all of their rotation from one segment in the chain because they've lost it elsewhere. So we see this more often in some of the college stress fractures we see where, an athlete went to college, he was, 87 to 89 miles an hour, was on a great trajectory, got to college, put on 25 pounds his first year. All of a sudden he's throwing 91 to 93, he's getting better. And then sure enough, by sophomore and junior year, his low back starts killing him. He's lost a ton of his rotational capacity, and he may have a stress fracture. What you've done is you've taken a narrow infrasternal angle, you've given him way too much bilateral loading, you've compressed him front to back, and all of a sudden he's lost a lot of what made him special. So sometimes it leads to poor performance. Sometimes it actually leads to, an injury like this. So being mindful of not robbing rotational athletes of rotation should be a universally aware trend that we see in strength coaches, but unfortunately it doesn't always work that way. Scenario 4 would be a classic wide ISA. So think power lifter, linebacker. You actually see a lot of NFL linemen, believe it or not, who have spondylolysis because they're very well equipped for compression, right? They're good at running into things, they're good at back squatting, but they don't handle extension well. So when they start backpedaling off the line as they're blocking, you actually see them slam in and beat up on a basically all those facets as well as the pars interarticularis. So name an NFL lineman who's a good golfer, and you're probably going to have a really short list. In adolescence, these athletes are typically ones who have lost a lot of range of motion through the hips and the thoracic spine. These are kind of the square builds. They have square faces to match their bodies as well. They usually need to recapture some global rotation, particularly through the hips and the thoracic spine. But more importantly, they need to find patterns that allow them to be successful in tight windows. So if you see a wide ISA pitcher that has terrible direction in his delivery, the only way he can throw strikes is to really go and demand a lot of motion through his spine that he doesn't have. So, if you're going to give them a little bit more of a linear path to the plate, you might cue them throw in a narrower hallway or throw in a phone booth, something like that just allows them to not have to demand so much rotation through the system. Interestingly, these athletes, these wide ISA, power lifter, linebacker builds, they have big vertebral bodies and larger intervertebral discs. So these athletes, as I mentioned, handle compression well and rotation worse. You don't see nearly as many discogenic problems with them. Conversely, the narrow infrasternal angles handle compression poorly. These are smaller vertebral bodies. The discs are smaller, but they're Gumby spines that can handle a lot of bending and rotation. So the narrows are probably more susceptible to some of these stress fractures versus the wides, who are more, susceptible to having more, issues that, just because they generally are avoiding a lot of rotational patterns. They're not successful in these sports nearly as much. So we just have to understand what different spines are made to do and train accordingly. And then the last scenario, number 5, is it's an adult with a chronic spondy. What's interesting is I've actually seen 4 upper lumbar stress reactions fractures in compressed narrow professional athletes in their 20s and 30s in the past 18 months. These athletes are not ones that get thrown in back braces. They always are conservative treatment. And if they flare up, they often do well with injections to settle the area down. But more likely, the fracture is actually a clue to you as to how they move for an extended period of time. So when I see these athletes that come in that have this in their history, and it's maybe more than just an incidental finding that came up on imaging when someone had an oblique strain, or they were looking at something else, they usually require a very different weight room strategy, and it's absolutely life-changing when they recapture global extension and rotation instead of banging on one segment. So when you have a segment that's taking on tons and tons of the stress, it's probably because you either have way too much motion or you haven't got enough motion at several different segments to kind of spread the demands across multiple joints. So I blabbered on for way too long now, but big picture to recap this. Spondylolysis and to some degree spondylolisthesis are super common. They may not always be symptomatic. It may be an incidental finding. So it's really important that you get a good doctor in the mix who can confirm that the site of the pain is actually where the spondy is on the imaging. And in some cases, it may be an incidental finding and something else is causing the problems. These issues can occur for a lot of modifiable and non-modifiable reasons, both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So you have to control what you can control. What I would tell you is good movement, which is matched to individual builds. I talked about narrow versus wide infrasternal angle. Is one thing that we looked at. It will never let you down if you chase good movement quality and preserve rotational capacity that's well controlled with solid motor control and a comprehensive strength conditioning program. But big picture, controlling volume and intensity and avoiding excessive hyper specialization in youth sports are your best strategies for prevention. When I see athletes that come into this, it's usually because they did too much of one activity for too long. It was 6 months in a row of gymnastics with no break. It was 120 swings in the cages every day of the week for too long, or it was pitching and pitching and pitching instead of going and playing a different sport that gives some variety to them. I would also add that strength conditioning at a young age is incredibly helpful. I mentioned those loosey-goosey young athletes. They thrive with just some good motor control in the right places. Like I said, my daughters are 10 and they're already in the weight room doing some stuff to kind of help offset what they do at gymnastics. But do appreciate that years later, if you do strength conditioning incorrectly, it can actually cause a lot more harm than good in the later years. So a big way to keep track of this is monitoring global rotational capacity. So if you go into a training program and you lose 20 degrees of hip internal rotation and 30 degrees of thoracic rotation in the first 6 months, it's not a good training program for you, particularly if you are in an extension and rotation sport. So as I mentioned, I'm super comfortable managing these. If anyone has questions, this is a challenging thing to deal with. You can always shoot us an email, cspflorida@gmail.com, or just contact us through cresseyperformance.com, and we'll happily talk you through some stuff. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and be sure to check out those new CSP Minimus collaborations at newbalance.com. Just search for CSP there and check them out before they're out of stock. Thanks so much.